And now, we've reached the infamous Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric on Wii U, which released back in 2014. When I first conceptualized this Sonic retrospective, I didn't even think I was covering this game, but obviously I changed my mind. But before we even get into it, I figured I'd take this moment to tell you that my merch store has added some cool new items, including a coffee mug, stickers, pins, and we've dropped the prices on all existing items just in time for the holiday season. Since I know wearing my name in public is everything you've ever dreamed of, I figured I'd take the chance to announce this fact. Now back to your regularly scheduled, or not so regularly scheduled, Sonic content. This game is pretty important in the history of Sonic despite its near-forgotten reputation today. The reason why I had figured I wouldn't even bother covering this one was because I didn't own a copy of it until recently, and the reason for that is because of what happened when the game came out. To get into this video, it's best to travel back in time and tell the story from the beginning. If you watched my video on Sonic Team's version of Sonic Lost World, you'd know how we got to that point and how I felt about that game. When it first released in 2013, I thought it was bad, something I've become more neutral on since. So neutral that I feel no strong feelings about Lost World one way or the other, it just kind of exists to me. But going into 2014, I did not like the new Sonic game, which was quite the change from the norm. In the fandom, Lost World sparked some fiery debate because its mediocre critic scores suggested that Sonic might slide back into being a laughingstock after Sonic Colors and Sonic Generations brought so much goodwill back to the name. So you had camps of people who really liked Lost World, people who didn't like it, and people who were in the middle, but largely I'd say the community was still hopeful for the future of Sonic because of that goodwill I just mentioned. Myself included because Lost World was just the Mario ripoff side game. Surely Sonic Team's big PS4 game would save the day, right? So pretty early on in 2014, we got word on what was next for Sonic the Hedgehog. Not another game from Sonic Team, it was instead the launch of an entirely different branch of the Sonic franchise called Sonic Boom. Back in the 2000s, the show Sonic X on 4Kids brought a ton of new young fans into the series alongside the latest games releasing on all major platforms. SEGA was hoping to recapture that magic in the 2010s with a new cartoon show, merchandise, and video games. Unlike Sonic X, Sonic Boom wasn't going to be based on the video games at all, instead being its own universe and story entirely. With that came altered character designs that tried to put the characters' traits at the forefront of their design. Sonic with sports tape, Tails wearing goggles and having a utility belt, and Knuckles, well, the difference was most striking for him. The cartoon was set to air in late 2014 and was going to be accompanied by two games, Sonic Boom Shattered Crystal, a 2D adventure on the 3DS that we'll talk about next week, and the game of today's video, Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric on Wii U. Upon announcement, weirdos online were losing their minds because different equals ruined, but the most rational Sonic fans felt even more trepidation about this game than Lost World just 1 year prior. That game still was set in the main series and was going to continue on with the same tone as the previous two games, so you had something to anchor your expectations to. But this was a total wildcard from the day it was announced, as the game was being developed by the Western studio Big Red Button, something that hadn't been the case for a big Sonic game since Sonic 2 and 3 were made in the West back in the 90s, which even then still had a lot of staff from Sonic Team. The gameplay being, well, difficult to discern since it didn't look anything like the games that came before this. And in a series as all over the map as Sonic, that's saying something. I don't really remember what I was thinking about in the lead up to Rise of Lyric, and in retrospect, I think it's because I wasn't thinking about it much at all. Instead, focusing my video game attention on getting into things I hadn't played before, like Zelda, or being hyped for Uncharted 4, which got announced the previous year. I think that's because my interest in Sonic was waning after Lost World, and Rise of Lyric was going to have to be really good to hold that attention, and in the days before it released, I actually became kind of interested in it, as its art direction was akin to the Jak and Daxter games that I love, and just did videos on, go watch them, both that series and this game having the same art director. But of course, if you're a Sonic fan, you know how that story turned out once the game was released on November 11th of 2014.
Generic and unpolished, Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric falls well below our already low expectations.
It's not a complete broken mess, it's just bad. It's poorly optimized and looks and runs like garbage, and lacks any kind of quality assurance put into it to see if the game is even fun.
There's no excuse for such a sloppy execution. As a Sonic game, it fails. As a platformer, there are so many better options out there. If you're a parent, don't treat your kids to this. Get them something that'll last, something with a little polish and love, like Mario Galaxy or 3D World.
Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric is a failure at some basic levels of gaming. While it's understandable that a franchise may want to move beyond the simple elegance of its origins, a muddled web of poorly connected and even more poorly executed systems is not the answer. The Sonic name deserves better than this, and so do consumers.
Like I said at the start, this game swept the internet back when it came out for all the wrong reasons. The critics, both professional and on YouTube, were slamming Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric for its utter lack of quality control and its boring substandard gameplay. The worst part about it would be that Sonic is no stranger to crappy games. I'm not talking about some obscure Game Gear title here, I'm obviously referring to Sonic 06 on PS360. That was a game that only 8 years prior had shocked the critics and fanbase with its lack of quality control and for blatantly being unfinished and sold for full price. This was the disaster that Sonic Colors and Generations had almost entirely recovered the franchise from, but here we have Sonic Boom 8 years later showing that SEGA had learned nothing and still had zero regard for their audience, thinking they could get away with another game that was blatantly unfinished, poorly optimized, and just not good. The writing was on the wall early on, as people who played the demo at E3 2014 said the game wasn't that good, but it really couldn't have prepared people for the lengthy slog players were dumped with once the game finally released. I can tell you, I was in that camp. To repeat, I really didn't have much to say about this before it finally came out, but I got it around launch and I played it for about 2 hours, and I thought it was absolutely atrocious. No two ways about it. It was boring, it was repetitive, and it was the last straw for me. I knew this game was terrible pretty early on in its runtime, so after I got past this time travel stage, I just stopped playing. I decided to trade the game in. Back when I was 14 and didn't have the money to spend, so you had to trade games in for chump change. But I figured I'd trade it in while it was new enough to get whatever I could out of it. I then watched all the YouTubers cover this mess, and that was good enough for me. I didn't need to play the rest of it, and I didn't for years afterwards. You can see my original save file right there. I picked this copy up a while ago knowing I'd be doing this review, and here we are. The larger point I'm making is, Rise of Lyric convinced me that I had simply grown out of Sonic. Think about it. I loved every Sonic game as a kid. Come 2010, and I'm watching YouTubers, and I learned that most of these games I like aren't very good, like Heroes, Shadow, 06, and the Storybook games. I accept this fact, and then I go and enjoy Colors and Generations just like everyone else. Sonic had a meh game in 2012, and then in 2013 you get Lost World, which I hated, and then in 2014 you get Rise of Lyric, which was even worse. So yeah, I traded it in. I had my sights set on games like The Last of Us Remastered on PS4, which became my favorite game of all time, and also getting into great retro games like Mega Man X, which also became a personal favorite, while Sonic produced garbage like Rise of Lyric. I was convinced that I was done. Sonic just wasn't for me anymore. Obviously, I have walked this back considerably, but the years after Rise of Lyric certainly helped cement the idea in my mind. The story about how I got back into caring about Sonic again can wait for the videos on Sonic Mania and Sonic Forces, but my point is made. For me, the Colors and Generations goodwill was gone, because Sega let yet another disaster release less than a decade after their last one, which was how a lot of people felt as Sonic was back to being a punchline.
No matter how fast he sprints, Sonic just can't seem to outrun the curse that follows him from game to game. Big Red Button's Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric game ties in with the new Cartoon Network show, but this new entry still suffers from problems that have plagued this series for years. Even worse, it layers on a new level of sloppy combat for Sonic and his friends.
Which might lead an uninformed audience member to wonder, what did the game do specifically that was so awful? I mean, that's the interesting thing. I feel like the game's mechanics don't really have much to offer, so there really isn't much to talk about with them. The issue isn't the abundance of flaws like 06, the game is just bad, for reasons I can tell you now that I've suffered through its lengthy campaign. But still, instead of its flaws being the biggest takeaway, it's more about the absence of good qualities. Although in fairness, it does have some good qualities. So I figured I'd go over them before diving into the issues. The area Rise of Lyric received unanimous appreciation for was in its cutscene animation. Characters moving in a really natural way while still looking cartoony and showing a variety of facial expressions. The cutscenes slow the pace down whenever necessary to give the characters personality-defining moments. This is a real breath of fresh air for the series since the cutscenes in Colors and Generations felt a lot more stock in comparison to the more dynamic, action-oriented scenes in Sonic Unleashed. Sonic Lost World was a step forward from those games I mentioned, but Rise of Lyric in terms of the animation and cutscene pacing achieves what I want from Sonic, although I'd guess I'd want more action scenes thrown into the mix, but you get what I'm saying. The voices of the characters are still the same ones we've had since Sonic Colors and Free Riders, except for Tails. He got recast in Boom, now being played by Colleen O'Shaughnessy, who has continued playing Tails to this day, even in the second Sonic movie. But as I was saying, I feel like these voices fit the Boom renditions of the characters more than the game versions, probably because they were designed with these voices in mind. Boom Sonic being a lot more cynical, so Roger's snarkier Sonic feels pretty at home in the Boom universe.
Knuckles and Tails, you stay back in case the village is attacked again.
Who put you in charge? I say Tails and I will stay back and protect the village, and you and Sonic take the elevator.
You win this round, Knuckles. Amy, let's go.
But that's genuinely the only positives I can give out to this game. Even the presentation has problems. For example, the transition between cutscenes and gameplay are incredibly amateurish. As you'll hit the trigger for a cutscene and it'll just abruptly start playing even if there was still dialogue going on in the gameplay, and once the scene is over it will just abruptly cut back to gameplay where the previously interrupted dialogue will just resume. It really takes you right out of the game. The voice acting in the cutscenes might be nice, but in-game I have a lot of issues. The quality of the audio sounds pretty off, like it came right from the recording studio and into the game. This sounds weird to say because all audio in games do that, but there's something about the delivery of the in-game lines that I can't unhear. The characters will be running at warp speed or pulling down a giant worm, and when they talk, which they do a lot, it just sounds like they're recording a line with no enthusiasm in the booth. Just listen to it.
Hey, early bird gets the...
Worm! I think it's safe to say that entering the tomb was probably a bad idea.
No! You think?
Let's just stop this guy and then argue, okay?
I'm not saying it had to be Spider-Man PS4 where they recorded an active version of all Peter's lines and a standing version. I'm just saying, you'd hope they'd direct the lines better to make it fit where it's going to be used. Something I think previous Sonic games have done just fine with, but that's nothing compared to the sheer volume of in-game dialogue. Rise of Lyric puts Sonic Heroes to shame with its unrelenting assault on your ears with repeated audio samples. Almost every time you hit a bounce pad, the character will feel the need to say that you touched a bounce pad. But that's not all. Get ready to hear, "It's like these tracks were built for me. Can't collect too many rings. I love these boost rings. Can't slow Sonic down," at almost every turn.
Super boost ring! Can't slow Sonic down. It's like these tracks were built for me. Can never grab too many rings. I can do this all day. Boom! Yeah! Nice little trinket.
Activate that button!
Stop!
The player does have the ability to turn the voice's volume to 0, but I didn't since I figured that was some kind of a universal slider that would also affect cutscenes that I didn't want to miss out on. So during the gameplay, I had no choice but to listen to the same quips again and again, or characters having dull-sounding reactions to a giant monster chasing them that you must listen to every time you die, like, say, this shooting minigame I died at 3 times, spending a total of 10 minutes on. But that's only scratching the surface with the problems here. To put it nicely, this game runs like garbage. Somehow, Sonic 06 with its 30-second load screens and frequent slowdown manages to win out between these two as the game targeted and usually hit 60 frames per second. Rise of Lyric barely managed 30 FPS while struggling to load in the most basic of environments. Shadow effects and textures popping in frequently, the game lagging almost constantly in combat and especially in speed sections, making dodging obstacles and getting the right timing on collectibles borderline impossible here. All for graphics which don't even look that good. Sonic Lost World was 60 FPS with much higher fidelity, as were other Wii U exclusives like Mario 3D World and Super Smash Bros. This game's areas almost all look bland artistically, but then the textures and models look like a high-end PS2 game for something that dropped in 2014. A shameful showing compared to what else the console was putting out. And it's also buggy as all get out. This being the main thing people were ripping into at launch. For me, I hit this one weird glitch where after a speed section I noticed I only had 3 characters on the screen, so I switched to who was missing only for them to still be on the track and running at the default speed and clipping through the ground towards their doom. Besides that, I didn't run into any major glitches, probably because this was the 1.10 version that came out after launch that tried fixing that sort of thing. So my main issue was just how it ran. Although apparently, the patch reduced the frame drops and lag, so I can only imagine what playing the game at launch was like. In reality, how this game handles was something no amount of patches was ever going to fix. Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric was the only Wii U game to run on the Cry engine, a game engine that's been used across multiple consoles and titles, but evidently getting the thing to run on the Wii U was an absolute nightmare. This being one of the leading causes for Rise of Lyric turning out the way it did. That begs the question, if the engine was not compatible with the Wii U, why was this a Wii U exclusive? Well, I'm glad you asked, viewer of this video, because I'm going to tell you why. In 2013, it was announced that SEGA and Nintendo had signed an exclusivity deal making it so that the next 3 Sonic games would be exclusive to their hardware. Sonic Lost World was Game 1, Mario and Sonic at the 2014 Sochi Olympics was Game 2, and Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric was Game 3. The reason they did this goes back years. When SEGA officially stopped making consoles in the early 2000s, Sonic went multi-platform and reached new audiences. Sonic Adventure 2 on the Dreamcast being one of his weakest games in terms of sales because of how bad the console was doing by that point, but Sonic Adventure 2 Battle on Nintendo's GameCube had sold over 1 million. They rushed Sonic Heroes out the door to get as much money out of it as possible, which also paid off. Sonic's lineup on the Game Boy Advance sold really well, as did his games on the Nintendo DS. But then on the Wii, every game was a mega hit. Secret Rings, Unleashed, the Olympic Games, Black Knight, and Sonic Colors all sold millions. Sonic was right at home on his former rival's console. So then you get the Wii U, and now Sega locks themselves into a deal with Nintendo to release 3 Sonic exclusives for the console in the hopes of making as much bank as humanly possible. This completely blew up in Sega's face. The Wii U did not just sell less than its predecessors, it was a commercial flop. The Wii U is Nintendo's lowest selling home console of all time, even lower than the GameCube back in the 2000s, which was already kind of meh by Nintendo standards. It just did not have the kind of marketing power that the Wii did. You can analyze the failure of the Wii U in multiple ways. In fact, some great videos have been done on the subject here on YouTube. But the point is, the Wii U was a disaster. From its mixed messaging on if it was a hardcore console or another family-oriented device like the Wii, whether or not it even was a new console or an add-on to the Wii was an issue. It was underpowered, not reaching the same heights as the Xbox 360, which was at this point both 8 years old and a previous generation console, as the PS4 and Xbox One came out a year after the Wii U and smoked it. The Wii U was also difficult to develop for because of how developers had to divide resources between the console and the Wii U's gamepad gimmick. Even Nintendo's big IPs couldn't save this one. The Switch releasing and replacing the thing in 2017. I think the failure of the Wii U is pretty sad, all things considered. I've always liked it, in spite of its fundamental flaws. It had a nice interface and a massive library of downloadable retro games, this being how I first got into the Mega Man series, for example. I always thought the gamepad was cumbersome, but that's what the Pro Controller was for. However, Lost World and Rise of Lyric required players to use the pad, which kinda sucked. I haven't used the Wii U regularly in years, though. I had to drag it out of a box for this video, and the one on Sonic Lost World from a few months back. And damn, it was dusty. Point is, the thing was a flop, despite how many good games were on it. But this brings us back to Sonic. Rise of Lyric was initially not being developed for the Wii U. This project was in the works for years prior to 2014. But when SEGA decided to do a new cartoon show, this game, Sonic Synergy, was reworked significantly to become Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric. And it had to be on Wii U because of Sega's exclusivity deal with Nintendo, even though the CryEngine was not going to work with the Wii U, as the game was being made for the PS360. Sega fully knew this game was destined to be unfinished well before release, and forced it onto Wii U nonetheless. And yes, Sega knew this game sucked. They didn't even send out review copies of this game, not before launch, not even at launch. IGN reported on launch day that they went out and bought copies of it. Sega was really squeezing every last dollar out of the game to the point where the people whose job it was to inform consumers about how bad it was had to buy the game first. I don't blame Big Red Button for this mess, I blame Sega, because of the amount of negligence and utter disregard for the consumers it took to get to this point was entirely on them. They signed that deal with Nintendo, they knew Rise of Lyric wasn't going to work, and instead of delaying it to hopefully get it running properly or just make some other Wii U game, they forced this one out knowing consumers were being given a poor product, showing they had learned absolutely nothing from Sonic 06's poor reception. And honestly, that's my biggest takeaway from this game and the state it was released in. I almost don't care about the game itself because what matters is that Sega tried pulling another fast one on the consumers, something they'd never do now, except, yeah, they do. This is the most important thing about Rise of Lyric. This Wii U deal, for lack of a better phrase, and the game's being doomed from the moment it was forced onto the Wii U. This is the critical moment in Sonic's history I was talking about, as the result of both were cataclysmic. We've been going on for almost 20 minutes now and haven't even talked about the gameplay, and that's because, as established, there's almost nothing to talk about. Have you ever played a Lego game? If so, you can understand Rise of Lyric. It's the most basic, bland kids game you'll ever play. You run around areas following icons to destinations, and in levels you beat up enemies and solve puzzles. What makes LEGO games fun for the whole family is that they have a lot of charm, especially in adapting decades-old properties in fun new ways for people who have seen them for decades, or perhaps a new generation that never has before. I loved playing LEGO Star Wars and Indiana Jones back on the Xbox 360. Rise of Lyric is like a LEGO game in that it's mechanically simplistic and that the game has opportunities for co-op. However, it's unlike LEGO games in that it's completely bottom-of-the-barrel gameplay that goes on for 8 hours and has none of that charm. In fact, it has anti-charm with its obnoxious verbal diarrhea.
I'm out of here! I'm out of here!
I think I need to invent autopilot.
Can't catch me now! Can't catch me now! Can't catch me now!
I just said that you solve puzzles in this game, but that's stretching the phrase to its absolute limit. The most recurring puzzle in this game are pulling switches to make things happen, hitting a button to make something happen, or following a path on the ground in sequence where there's no punishment for stepping on the wrong one or just getting off the path entirely. Although this is harder than it seems because the ground control in this is shockingly awful. Despite the slow run speed, and believe me, it is a slow run speed, going in a straight line in this is surprisingly difficult because the controls are super slippery. It's just very unpleasant to play. If that wasn't bad enough, you also get copious amounts of combat throughout the campaign. This might be one of the worst combat systems I've ever played, if you can even call it that. Hours and hours of just beating up the same enemies, mashing the Y button like there's no tomorrow. All 4 characters don't even seem to have much of a benefit in combat from one another either, just keep hitting the same buttons again and again, doing the same combo over and over. You get the illusion of making it faster with Sonic's 3-hit homing attack or with each character's charge attack, but this is combat with no depth whatsoever. The attempts at variety, like the enter beam pulling enemy shields away and the random item drops that have limited use, only further highlights how little's really going on with this game. It's completely mind-numbing and yet takes up most of the game. But I would like to use this opportunity to talk about button mashing combat in a more general sense. I think the phrase gets demonized a lot since naturally we'd want more complexity in our mechanics, but a simpler combat system is fine by me. It's not the amount of combos and mechanics that matters, it's the usage of them. For example, in the infamous Devil May Cry 2, Dante has 8 combos with Rebellion. Combine that with your various gun tactics and wall running, and DMC2 can be a game that you play like this if you feel so inclined. This is still a terrible combat system because it teaches you none of this, is clunky and slow, and provides minimal satisfaction, and is just nothing like the other Devil May Cry games. You can also just shoot everything anyway. This is a terribly designed combat system from top to bottom, but it does have combos in it. By comparison, the fan-made Project Sonic 06 is an awesome combat system which, yes, has button mashing like the original Sonic 06, but making it faster and less janky alone is an instant improvement. When you add in satisfying sound and visual effects on, say, Shadow's Chaos Snap, you have something inherently satisfying to do as you zip between enemies, mashing the buttons faster to hit them faster, leveling up the Chaos Snap to gain extra attacks. There's a lot more I can say about PO6 combat, but I'm just gonna wait for that silver release video first. But the point is, this is a combat system with not much in terms of sheer variety, but in its usage, it's fun. Rise of Lyric is a game where button mashing combat sucks because the enemies are lame or predictable, death has no threat because you respawn right where you died, and then there's no variety in your attacks throughout the entire lengthy game, and so you're just bored out of your mind by the 30-minute mark. And when you've reached that, you still have over 7 hours left. Time where the complexity does not rise in the slightest bit. There really is nothing to say about the mechanics. I mean, the speed sections are almost all automated, but when you do have to react, it's a nightmare because of the frame rate. The bosses are all predictable rubbish of tossing things at them with the enter beam. The platforming is extremely basic and obvious. The collectibles and upgrades provide zero practical use. The side quests are so lame that Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty would scoff at them, and the story, while it has more going on than Colors Through Lost World, it still feels like a lot is missing here. Such as Sonic having this character arc where he needs to trust that his friends are capable of protecting themselves, when this was the debut of Boom Sonic, so we really have no history of these characters. Lyric as a villain offering little other than someone to fight, as the game does bubkiss with him being from the ancient past, and Sonic traveling back to seal him away from when they found him at the start. Unlike 06, actually. Eggman has become a full comic relief character, as has Knuckles, and then Shadow appears out of nowhere for all of 2 scenes where he acts like a playground bully, and then appears at the end of the game to do nothing again. The point of this game's story was to set up the plot of the show, but that doesn't work for reasons I can explain in the next video. And besides that, the show has no story, so really the only thing that vaguely matters from this game is the heroes landing on this island and meeting Styx, who's a regular member of their crew in the show, but is a side character NPC in Rise of Lyric, no different than anyone else. You could say it's this biplane that's found in the game and destroyed in the first episode of Boom, but the plane also gets busted at the end of the game, too. Maybe it was fixed, who knows? All I know is, by the end, you feel absolutely hollow as the final battle with Lyric is the same mundane and predictable combat and platforming you've been doing all game long. But hey, at least you feel relieved that this piece of crap has finally ended. Roll the E-tier music from Mega Man X7. Sonic Boom, Rise of Lyric, now that I've finished it for the first time, is absolutely one of the worst Sonic games I've ever played. Now, it's not the worst, that still goes to Free Riders, which I covered back in May, but that does not leave Rise of Lyric with many points. This game is just a husk of nothing. I've used the word nothing like 10 times in this script, and that's because there really aren't many other words that come close to describing it. Like I said earlier, this game is just a much different beast from Sonic 06. That was a game that became so infamous because of how many ways it found to be shockingly awful. From its abysmal performance, poor optimization, janky collision detection, its buggy and unfinished nature, its wholly unsatisfying mechanics that kept finding new ways to hit the bottom of the barrel, combined with a story that left people scratching their heads more than anything else. That's 06. But in Rise of Lyric, it's really just because there's absolutely nothing good about it. It's the same dull trite for 8 hours that can barely function without making you think the Wii U's about to explode. For me, that's worse. Despite my obviously thinking 06 is a terrible game, I do have fondness for it that I spent 2 hours detailing in my video from 2020. When comparing Rise of Lyric to 06, I just think 06 is more interesting as a piece of media that tried to be something grand that failed spectacularly, versus this awful kids game. Moreover, I see potential in the final product of 06. Project 06 goes to show that the level design and structure of 06 was an intelligent mix of Sonic Adventure 1's approach and Sonic Adventure 2's. This was just buried by 06's crap factor, but with an overhaul to its mechanics it can really shine. In Rise of Lyric's case, whatever grandiose adventure Sonic Synergy was trying to be was long gone by the time the game was in the hands of the players. To do justice to some Jak and Daxter level adventure game starring Sonic and friends like Sonic Synergy was trying to be, you'd have to start completely from scratch because nothing in this game is anything like that besides the art design, which again, just leaves Rise of Lyric as an empty shell of a game. One that I'd like to just forget, but we can't. Rise of Lyric is, today, nowhere near as infamous as Sonic 06. I think that's partially because 06 was the first time SEGA truly stunned the masses with a game that lacked quality control to such a degree, so it really had an effect on people's perception of the series, still being an easy target to this day. Rise of Lyric, comparatively, offers little to make fun of besides the word bounce pad, but I also think there's an even larger reason as to why this is the way it is. Sonic 06 was also a game played by over 1 million people, launching on the 360 and the PS3, Rise of Lyric being a Wii U exclusive, so it all comes full circle now. The Wii U's failure proved cataclysmic for corporate Sega's Diabolical scheme. They put a lot of money into the Sonic Boom launch, and the returns were abysmal, as Rise of Lyric was not only the worst reviewed Sonic game, but also the lowest selling, giving the Sonic series some actual financial punishment for releasing an unfinished product, something that did not happen back in 2006. In general, they took every wrong step they could have when doing Sonic Boom. I mean, the show itself, regardless of its quality on its own, just feels misguided from its inception, really dialing in on the humor people liked in Sonic Colors, turning it into a slower-paced Sonic sitcom, more or less, that was meant to appeal to toy-playing aged boys. It wasn't a good action show, nor did it have the energy and colors of Teen Titans Go to entertain the really little kids. Combine that with super early airing times, and thus, the Boom TV show didn't last past a second season. That last point was out of Sega's hand, but still, I'm just saying it wasn't a success. And the merchandise, where most of the funding for these kinds of shows comes from, also sold incredibly poorly. When speaking from personal experience, Sonic stuff was a hot commodity in the toy store aisles back in the 2000s and early 2010s. And then you have the games, which as I said also didn't sell well because of extremely poor word of mouth, and the fact that one of them was on the Wii U, tainting the entire Sonic Boom brand right out of the gate. A multi-million-dollar disaster Sonic Boom was, resulting in massive layoffs and a couple years without a proper new Sonic game. I feel really bad for the people who lost work because of this, because it was nobody's fault. Besides the suits who, as I said, made every wrong decision here and tanked their entire project, only hurting the people who worked the everyday jobs. This is why I think Rise of Lyric had a worse overall effect on the series from an internal perspective compared to 06. 06 sold well, so we bounced back with Unleashed just 2 years later. Colors and Generations moving us in a direction where 06 could be a thing of the past. But Rise of Lyric's utter failure killed all that goodwill and left a financial hole in the series that you can still feel the effects of to this day, which I think is a natural point to end the video on. I'm not quite done with the Sonic Boom brand, as next week we're going to tackle the handheld Sonic Boom games and discuss how they played a role in this mess, and how my interest in Sonic being killed by Rise of Lyric affected those games for me. But of course, there's more. Right after that, we'll discuss the beloved comeback game, Sonic Mania, and then finally, right before the release of Frontiers, we'll circle back to the game that kicked off this entire Sonic retrospective, Sonic Forces. So stay tuned, a lot of exciting stuff's coming up on the channel. But until then, I'll say what I always do. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.